not sure I know the fellow they were describing a minute ago. I grew up on 172nd Street and Walton Avenue in the Bronx, New York, and I'm still that guy. Happy to have been living here in Montreal since 1964. Merci. I've expanded my talk just a little bit because I want to draw some of the parallels in the denial of genocide, which are so important to understanding the denial of the Armenian Genocide and the genocide against the Tutsi of Rwanda. Because I think the foundation of this discussion rests on those parallels, I beg your indulgence to go a little bit beyond my title to include these two additional cases. Let me say at the very outset, you can go to the next slide around. Let me say at the outset that this community, the community of the Armenian people here in Montreal, has embraced the work that Kurt Jonasson and I started on genocide in 1978 at Concordia University, and taken it to its heart. And I want to reciprocate that connection, that affection, that support in any way that I can. And it's not difficult to do that. When I first started teaching the history and sociology of genocide in 1980 with Kurt, we were privileged very soon after we began to have a visit to our class by a gentleman by the name of Kerup Bedukian, of blessed memory, the founder of the Ararat Rug Company on Park Avenue, and a man who gave employment to hundreds and hundreds of young Armenians who came as immigrants to Quebec. It all started with a flood in our basement, something Montrealers can identify with if they've been around long enough. And the insurance company asked Mr. Bedukian to come and estimate the damage to our carpet in the basement. So he came in, I'd never met him before, no idea who he was. And he was looking around, and my study is in the basement, and I had a copy of our book on the history and sociology of genocide on my desk because I was taking some notes for a lecture I was giving. And he looked down, and here he is. He's this, as far as I know, this carpet insurance assessor, right? And he says, oh, a book on genocide. I've written a book on genocide. And that's the kind of guy he was. So I said, is that right? I had no idea what he was going to say next, but I asked him the obvious question, what did you write? And he said, well, actually, I was in a genocide. And with my mother, I was in a caravan of death. And we narrowly survived. And I've written a memoir of what happened to us. It's called The Urchin, and I will send you a copy. And he did. And I read it. And then I understood everything about Mr. Bedukian that a historian could understand. It's an amazing story, beautifully told. Not only moving, but full of insights. He was just a little boy, but he remembered so much. And we miss him even now. When he came to my class, I asked him simply to talk about what he described in the book, and then to answer questions from the students. But he began with his own introduction. As usual, he was his own man. And he started out this way. He said, "It's a great privilege to be here. I never thought I'd be lecturing in a university. But I want to tell you something. I'm going to describe some pretty horrible things. And I'm going to tell you about some of the worst things that people can do to fellow human beings. And they were done to us by Turkish people. But if you leave the room tonight after my discussion and you hate Turkish people, you will not have understood my message. If it were not for good Turkish people, I would not be alive and standing here tonight." And he simply invaded the room with that sense of humanity and the importance of mutual respect among human beings and the importance of fellow feeling, which I want to come to at the conclusion of my discussion of denial. So let's go on around to the next slide. As you know, the government of Turkey persists in denying the events of 1915. And together, we've come a long way dealing with this. Because I sold our house and with my wife moved into a condo this September, I was going through some old files. And there among those files was my correspondence with the Turkish ambassador to Canada in the year 2000. Because at a talk like this, it was actually at a conference in Ottawa, I spoke about the Armenian Genocide. In fact, all I had done was to list it in a slide like this among other genocides. I hadn't really lectured. It was actually a conference on Rwanda. But I listed it among the genocides. And the Turkish ambassador wrote a letter to me to say, "I was in the room when you did that. And I want you to know there was no such thing as the Armenian Genocide." And if you will look up the legal definition of genocide, you will discover that the experience of the Armenian people does not coincide with the legal definition of genocide. Well, of course, I was very familiar with the legal definition of genocide, and I drafted a reply. I was also in the file, and without going into too much detail, I laid out the basic facts and conveyed them to him. But I also included a copy of Ambassador Morgenthau's dispatch to the State Department, in which he said explicitly and clearly the Turkish government is seeking to kill every last Armenian. This is, in my experience, an unprecedented attempt to destroy the very biological foundations of a people, and we must do something. And I said, I hope you will take seriously the words of one of your fellow ambassadors, part of the Club of Diplomats, and pay attention to why he said that. And the correspondence concluded with his reply, which he said, "Dear Professor Chalk, I've read your response to my letter, and I have to tell you that when I wrote to you, I did not intend to start a debate on the question. Consequently, I will not communicate further with you about this, but I am sending you some books." And he sent the classic 4 Turkish denial books of the year 2000, which I already had 3 sets of in my office. I was finding it hard to discover space in which to store them so that they could be used by researchers on denial in the future. That was the end of our communication. But it's not the end of the story, as you know. So the position of the Turkish government in 2000 and till today was that the Armenian people were traitors backing Russia in the early years of the First World War, that their deaths were simply the casualties of the First World War, and like the hundreds of thousands of Turks, Armenians also died as a consequence of disease, famine, and battle around their homes. There was no genocide. Indeed, the Armenians were never as numerous as they claimed to be. There were really hardly more than 200,000 of them. So how could there have been perhaps as many as 1 million deaths? And the reason why the Armenians are making such a fuss about this is that they really are looking for ways to acquire land and wealth, which rightly belongs to Turkey. So they exaggerate. Go to the next slide. Let's look at the Ukrainian experience. Now, the famine of 1932-33 in the Soviet Union, which was then led by Stalin, was a consequence of the decision of the Central Committee under Stalin to confiscate enormous quantities of grain from Ukraine, which was the breadbasket of the Soviet Union, and also from some of those areas which Ukrainians had emigrated to within the Soviet Union, where food was also confiscated en masse. The need for the grain that was seized, which included the seed grain for the next year's crop, arose from the failure of Stalin's 5-year plan, in which the collectivization of agriculture had been accomplished, but the productivity of the Soviet farmers declined drastically. The famine was not a natural famine, not a consequence of any sort of drought or other natural disaster, not a consequence of floods. And the fact that it was actually what we call man-made, I don't think women want credit for it, so I'll stay with man-made, arises from the evidence that even when food packages and relief shipments were addressed to Ukraine, the Soviet government deliberately and consciously refused to deliver them. And when Ukrainians did what is normal all over the world when famine strikes and tried to flee to areas of the Soviet Union where food was plentiful, they were turned back at bayonet and rifle points by Soviet guards at the frontiers between Ukraine and its neighboring republics. And so some 5 to 6 million Ukrainians starved to death. Let's go to the next slide, please. What kind of denial could be possible in the face of that kind of action? Well, the Soviets controlled foreign journalists very carefully. They had compromised many of those stationed in Moscow, and most of all, they had compromised Walter Duranty because he was the New York Times correspondent based in Moscow. They had a lot on him. He was married, but he had a lover with whom he lived in Moscow. He had entered into various shady relationships in addition, and the secret police had documented all of this with photographs, testimonies, etc. Walter Duranty was asked by his editors in New York to travel to Ukraine and report on whether there was a famine, the famine having been brought, news of the famine having been brought to New York by Ukrainians and others, including neutral diplomats. Durante got on a train, traveled to Kiev and other Ukrainian centers. He observed bodies all along the tracks of Ukrainians who tried to escape and had been shot or had fallen off the trains, pushed off the trains, many of them children, and took notes on all of that. When he returned to Moscow, he wrote 2 reports. The first was to the British Embassy, reporting what he had seen accurately. The second was his story to the editors of the New York Times, denying that there was a famine in Ukraine. That was the story that the New York Times published. It never got a story from Durante confirming the genocide, and later that year, Durante was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for journalism and accepted it without blinking. In the 1980s, when the Ukrainian community here in Montreal and elsewhere raised the famine as a possible genocide, the Soviet government, through its embassies, consulates, and allies in North America, put forward the argument that there might have been poor planning in the 1930s, and it might have caused food shortages, but those food shortages occurred all over the Soviet Union, and the Ukrainians were not specifically targeted. Indeed, in the 1990s, even after the communist regime had collapsed, the successor government in the Soviet Union, the government of Russia, the Russian Federation, insisted there had been no planned famine in Ukraine. Even after, in that brief period, when the Soviet archives were open to foreign researchers, the documents were discovered in which Stalin wrote back and forth to Kaganovich and Molotov about the importance of not shipping food relief to Ukraine in light of what was happening. Indeed, the famine began just as the genocide in Turkey against the Armenians began, with the murder of Ukrainian intellectuals. And I guess there's a further parallel I should note. Just as in Turkey under the young or new Committee for Union and Progress, starting in 1907, Armenians felt for a while that they would be included in the new Turkish Republic. Instead, Stalin, who had allowed Ukrainians to educate their children in the Ukrainian language, first killed those teachers, professors, and political leaders who were responsible for introducing Ukrainian into the schools. He was seeking to terrorize the Ukrainians, not to accept collectivization per se, because they'd been forced to, but to ensure that they would never again raise their heads in the presence of great Russians who were now stating very clearly that they were in charge of the Soviet Union. And they would not tolerate any forms of resistance by the Ukrainians. If we go to the next slide. When the Nazis began the assault that we call the early Holocaust between 1933 and 1941, they always insisted that their goal was to force Jews to do honest labor. And so when they were sent after Kristallnacht in 1938 to concentration camps in thousands, Jewish men were put to forced labor and were told that surely this was the first time they'd worked an honest day in their lives. During the Holocaust, the cover story that the Nazis used for the shipments of hundreds of thousands of Jews to places like Auschwitz, and Auschwitz was only one of the later camps. There were many before, like Treblinka and Belzec, etc. The cover story was, you're going to labor in the East. You're going to do honest work. When the Holocaust became known, and it was not, again, like the Armenian Genocide, it took a while for people around the world to identify what had happened to the victims as not just part of war, not just part of some kind of small ethnic conflict, but something much larger. In the case of the Armenians, it should have been well known because, as you saw, Armin Wegner, the New York Times, and papers all around the world reported on the slaughter, which finally came to a genocide, of the Armenian people. But in the aftermath of the war, as industrial countries sought access to more petroleum, they quietly buried their memories of the assault on the entire Armenian people in Turkey and began to seek oil concessions on Turkish territory and to develop trade in the Eastern Mediterranean in areas that Turkey influenced. And so the Armenian Genocide, for all the money that was raised here in Canada and the United States for Armenian relief between 1915 and 1920, the Armenian Genocide was effectively forgotten. And that would have been the fate of those who perished in the Holocaust. Nuremberg was not about the Holocaust. Nuremberg was about Nazi aggression and small pieces of what we later came to recognize as the Holocaust. Very quickly, a group of Holocaust deniers emerged, starting around 1948, who said that what the witnesses in the later Nuremberg trials of 1946, 7, 8, 9, 50, 51 were saying was all lies. These were all hysterical survivors. They were not to be trusted. The rumor that Auschwitz was a death camp, which had huge gas chambers, was a total fabrication of the Jews. Yes, Jews had died in places like Auschwitz, but they were the victims of disease and famine. There were no gas chambers, and Jews were now lying, guess what? To gain wealth and to gain property and territory, and there had never been a Holocaust. We go on to the next one. We come to the most recent case that is well documented, an enormous genocide directed against the Tutsi of Rwanda in Central Africa. This genocide is as disgraceful as the ones I've spoken about earlier. In the case of the Armenians, the Allies were at war with Turkey. In the case of the Holocaust, the Allies were at war again. They were at war with Germany. Turkey was neutral. In the case of Ukraine, the Allies were not at war with the Soviet Union. Stalin was at war with his own people. And by the way, the grain which he confiscated was exported entirely to one destination. Does anybody know where that grain was sent? To Mussolini's Italy. Italy offered to trade grain for machinery. And so Stalin made a bargain. In the case of Rwanda, the United Nations had dispatched General Dallaire and a small United Nations peace force to maintain the peace during the elections that were going to be mandated under the Arusha agreements of 1993-94. Many of you now know the story of that United Nations assistance mission led by General Dallaire. what I want to focus on is the denial. And this has a great deal to teach us. The first part of the denial, which was crystallized by the defense lawyers representing the accused at the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, convening in Arusha, Tanzania, was that there had never been a systematic or sustained plan to murder the Tutsi of Rwanda. And if there was no plan, and the killing, as they claimed, was spontaneous, in other words, a spark fell onto an explosive mixture and it simply blew up, then under Article 2 of the Genocide Convention and Article 3 of the Genocide Convention, which requires that there has to be a criminal intent at the start of the process, some sort of plan, then there was no genocide, the defense lawyers argued. And if there was no planning and no genocide, then any conviction for genocide would be completely unjust, a corruption of the international criminal courts that had just evolved. From that position, after some of the accused were convicted of genocide and confessed to genocide, the defense lawyers went to a second position, which was that there had been two genocides. If the Tutsi victims were the victims of genocide, they said equally, the Hutu victims in Rwanda were also the victims of the genocide, this time perpetrated, they claimed, by the Rwanda Patriotic Front forces. And they asked, why is it that the tribunal never accused the Rwandan government, which was a government that was put in place by the Rwanda Patriotic Front and included Tutsi leaders like Paul Kagame and many others? Why was it that they were never charged for genocide and their other crimes? And if they were not so charged, these lawyers argued, this must mean that the court itself was bankrupt and had no legitimacy. The leader of the denialists in the case of Rwanda is a defense lawyer by the name of Peter Airlander. He's an American, he's from Minnesota, and was active in civil liberties work before he became a defense lawyer at the tribunal. And he's published numerous articles on the subject. What's disturbing to me is that for the sake of fairness and thoroughness in research, some institutions that should know better are beginning to take up some of his arguments, and particularly the argument that before President Habyarimana's plane was shot down on April 6, 1994, there was no planning to murder the Tutsi of Rwanda. And this is coming out in odd places. The U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, for example, in Washington, D.C., has just launched a special project that begins with the commemoration of the Rwandan genocide of 1994, 20 years later. And on its Genocide Facts web pages, which it seemed to be interested in explaining to the world that General Dallaire had acted to prevent the genocide by asking for permission to seize automatic rifles illegally brought to Kigali by the future killers. The Holocaust Museum has posted a discussion which, in its original form, essentially stated that it wasn't entirely clear that the genocide had been planned in advance, or that the informant who told General Dallaire that there were lists of Tutsi to be murdered was reliable, or that a lot of the evidence was really factual, and they sort of suspended judgment. So since January of this year, I've been engaged in a discussion with the responsible officers of the museum. It's been a very civilized discussion, but at any point in the discussion, I felt that we were in great danger, that the museum would stumble into integrating into the education of young people and others who view the museum website to a series of assumptions and arguments which can only be characterized as undermining the convictions of those convicted of genocide at the Rwanda tribunal. And this, despite the fact that although there had been appeals and some of the convictions were modified, if not overturned, most of them were not overturned, the case is solid, clear, and deep. So why has this happened? Where is the inspiration? Where is the root of Holocaust denial? How does this come about? Can we go to the next slide? Well, first of all, denialists learn from each other. And the Turkish deniers were the original teachers. They were the ones who first introduced the key arguments. There weren't so many of the victims as they claimed. It wasn't intentional, it was spontaneous, it was a consequence of war, and lots of other people died, so why focus on these people, etc. And those who argue that it was a genocide are themselves liars, selfish, and greedy. Second, while demonizing the victims and survivors as liars who deserve themselves, perhaps, in extreme cases, to be eliminated, the denial serves as an extremely effective way of blocking reconciliation and peace building. The denial itself is part of the process that the genocidal perpetrators initiated. It is the final stage of a genocide. It not only seeks to consolidate the biological destruction of the members of the group, it also seeks to erase their legitimate memory. You go to the next slide, please. We're also finding that genocide denial consolidates solidarity and loyalty to the regime and those who argue against the existence of the genocide among the members of the perpetrating group and their allies. And so group cohesion, which is so important, is strengthened by the denial process and helps to establish boundaries around the denial perpetrators that isolates them from anybody who might undermine their foundations. Now, in the case of West Germany, which was the first country ever to admit that it had perpetrated, that its predecessor government had perpetrated a genocide. The admission and the payment of compensation to victims served two purposes. First of all, it made the Federal Republic of Germany, as West Germany used to be known, acceptable as a partner and member of the international community. And secondly, it became a very important part of the evolution of democracy in West Germany, which the West German government stood on at election time, fought battles about with neo-Nazis and refugees from Eastern Europe, all of whom had an interest in not accepting that the Holocaust was real, and it strengthened Western democracy in Germany when Germany took responsibility for what the previous government had did. So, ladies and gentlemen, much has been said this evening by our wonderful colleagues who spoke before me about the success of the Armenian community here in Montreal. And I want to simply affirm with you, and I know you share this view, that while we seek to achieve that wonderful lightness of being, that grace in living, which the Armenian community, and I speak too to the survivors who are represented here tonight from Rwanda, from Cambodia, and many other sites of crimes against humanity and genocide. Let us also continue to struggle for the triumph of memory over forgetting. Thank you very much.